what would happen if, let's just start here. I just had this thought the other day. What would happen if every single Christian actually tithed, gave 10%, however you want to think about it? What would happen? What would be possible? Okay, so lickety split, here's where we're going to go. We're going to jump into some biblical background, like a very brief snapshot of church history, giving, generosity. We're going to look at how Christians currently give. And then we'll look at a couple of objections on why don't we give. Then finally, what would happen if every single Christian gave 10% of their income? This isn't meant to be any sort of like guilt trip. This is more just a hypothetical thought experiment. Hello. Welcome to the Finance Garden. I'm Thomas Stewart, a Jesus-loving, spreadsheet-crunching Minnesotan with a passion for helping people manage their money in a way that honors God. I'm so glad you're here. Understanding that how we manage our resources, big or small, is about more than just numbers. It's about living with purpose, intention, and the wisdom of stewardship. Okay, so off the top, Bible background. So we've got in Genesis 14, we've got Abraham. He gives the first recorded tithe, showing gratitude to God by returning a tenth of everything in recognition of the Lord's provision. And then Malachi, in Malachi 3, there's a verse that talks about bringing the full tithe into the storehouse, and it's kind of like a just do it and see what the Lord will do in response. You've got Leviticus 27. It talks about the tithe belonging to the Lord, it being an act of worship, not just a donation. Leviticus is crazy. This blew my mind. I didn't know this until literally just this past year. But 10%, if you're going to be completely legalistic about it, is not the number that you would give if you were going to follow all of the Levitical laws, and you add them all up, the mandatory tithe and offering amounts would actually be 23%. Blows my mind. I'll do a separate video on this probably in the future, but basically there's the 10% Levitical tithe, which we're all used to, which is given to the church, priests, Levites, those folks. And then there's a couple of others that if you total them all up, it actually averages to 23% of your income annually, basically was what was the mandatory tithes and offerings that they were giving. So pretty crazy. And then we jump into the New Testament. You've got Jesus critiquing legalism, but at the same time affirming the value of tithing when you pair it with justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You can find that in Matthew 23. You've got 2 Corinthians 9, which references God loving a cheerful giver. That's 2 Corinthians 9, 6, and 7. So you see the emphasis there is more on the heart than it is about any sort of like legal or commandment obligation. And then if we jump, where are we jumping? We're jumping to the big idea that we are left with when we look at the Bible passages, is that biblical giving baseline is about heart posture and trusting in the Lord. It's not a religious tax. So that's kind of our baseline as we start, is God loves a cheerful giver, and that's kind of the emphasis. So that's some of the biblical background. Like we've got the tithe. I grew up in church, and within the last few years started discovering that the 10% that I thought it wasn't really the point. So some quick church history here. Obviously, early church, you've got Acts 2, Acts 4 in the Bible that talks about radical generosity, believers selling possessions to meet needs. You've got church fathers who were encouraging tithing as a voluntary discipline, rooted in gratitude. You've got the medieval church then that comes along, and tithing became mandatory, often enforced by governments. So it started to blur the line between spiritual and political spheres. And then you've got the Reformation. So obviously we know the reformers pushed against some of the abuses around, things like indulgences, some of that. A lot of it kind of tied together with how the political and spiritual spheres blurred. So the reformers, obviously, they pushed against those abuses, but then upheld the call to generous living. And now, like today, in the modern era, tithing is taught mostly in evangelical circles. many Christians emphasize spirit-led generosity over fixed percentages. So you can kind of see the transition over time from the early church to today. But what I want to jump into here as we get into the meat and potatoes of what we're going to talk about is, how do Christians actually give? First thing off the top, most of this data refers to U.S. Christians, so that's just obviously some of the easiest data to find. So today, U.S. Christians give an average of 2.5% of their income. So you're making $100,000 a year, you'd be giving an average of $2,500 a year. Obviously, well short of what maybe we would consider the tithe. During the Great Depression, this is fascinating, it was actually 3.3%. So we are giving 0.8% less than folks were during the Great Depression. Pretty crazy. And that's obviously inflation adjusted because it is a percentage. Here's another one. 25% give nothing at all to the local church. That's pretty wild. Not casting judgment, but merely looking at obviously coming through the lens that we just talked about with the scripture of generosity outflowing being such a high value. It's very interesting to see these numbers break down. So at the end of the day, you got the hard truth that most Christians believe in generosity, but live kind of like with this someday giving mentality, where it's like, one day when I'm rich and I will be able to give my dad a brand new truck and not even blink. And we skip over the process that I think is so valuable to go through, where we enter into the headspace of what does it look like to be faithful giving where I'm at right now in this season. And there's not like a waiting until a baby step 7 or a $1 million bank account to start being generous and faithful, even with percentage points you think about, versus with the widow's mite, obviously the classic, the alabaster flask, where there's these extravagant outpouring purely as it's relative to their means. So then that begs the question, like, what prevents us from giving? What are the objections that come up? What are the things that maybe seem to cause a rub, the doubts that arise? First one, fear. What if I don't have enough? Can I trust God in scarcity? Convenience. I'll start giving when I make more. Distrust. Where does this money even go? Maybe you doubt the ministry or the church or the responsibility of the nonprofit, whatever it is. It's like there's a distrust factor that can arise. When it comes down to it, ultimately, you just have to vet where you give. And also, at the same time, your faithfulness isn't dependent on someone else's stewardship. This gets interesting if you listen to the last episode, when I talked with Bill Tibbetts, it came up on our job is to testify of Jesus. Our job is not to save. The same with generosity, with money. Our job is not to question the outcome of our giving. Our job is to give. Jesus doesn't give qualifiers when he talks about giving, which blows my mind from a common sense standpoint. And I think there's something to wrestle with there that I still haven't figured out, because my inclination is still to go, well, what are they going to do with this money? I want to see exactly whatever line item this dollar is going towards. So we've got fear, convenience, distrust, scarcity mindset. There's not enough to go around. Maybe you grew up with not a lot. There's a hold on to everything you can mentality, because money represents safety and security. Another reason maybe we don't give is because we're in debt. This is, I think, an invitation to start small, explore creative ways to give. Faithful, joyful giving can coexist with financial rebuilding, and I think that's understated. On top of being able to give time, talents, I think there even is space to give with discernment, even while rebuilding financially. Another objection, tithing was Old Testament law. This is true. I agree 100%. But also New Testament generosity increased, not decreased. Or maybe a final objection is we just don't believe our giving actually makes a difference, which I remember being in high school and making my first paycheck of, well, what was it, $500 or something, and going, well, what's $50 really going to do? So we've got all these objections. What would actually happen if every single U.S. Christian gave at least 10%? So we've got the data. Let me just re-breeze through it. U.S. Christians give an average of 2.5%. 25% don't give anything at all to the local church. So those are the numbers we're running with. What would happen if we changed those numbers so that 100% of Christians tithe at least 10%? Redundant because tithe means a tenth, blah, 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 nerdy details, not the point. Christians earn about $5 trillion annually in the US alone. I would assume this is well over this number. I think this number was from the early 2000s. But let's just say it's $5 trillion annually. That would mean we know that, Christians give on average 2.5%. If we took that 2.5% and pushed it to 10%, US Christians alone could unlock hundreds of billions of dollars every year for kingdom work, which is wild. It blows my mind. Like I said to start, this isn't an invitation to guilt somebody for giving less, giving more. I think it's more of a thought experiment of like what could happen among the church if we started giving more. And I think there is a tendency to disassociate from the larger problem. You see this happen with environmental issues. What's my carbon footprint going to truly do? You see this among problems that involve groupthink, where it's like, well, if nobody else changes, why would I change? And we'll get to that in a little bit, but let's just look at some of these staggering numbers, because I think hundreds of billions is hard to wrap your mind around. I can quantify a Taco Bell visit, but I can't quantify $100 billion worth of Taco Bell visits. So here's with that money that was tithed or would be tithed. So you've got $5 trillion annually, taxes, gross, net, tithing on which one, not going to go there. That's for you and the Lord to figure out. But with that money, we could eradicate extreme hunger and malnutrition, assuming that costs about $45 billion a year, solve the global clean water crisis, $150 billion. You could build 1,000 hospitals at $100 million each. That would be around $100 billion. Fund 1 million adoptions annually at $40,000 each. That would be about $40 billion. And then some non-numeral options, providing trauma care, counseling, housing, and restoration for every single trafficking survivor globally. You add all those up, you're not even at 400 billion on those. Insane. So you've got like all these global issues, like what could you solve on the global scale? What could the local church look like? Anything from like debt-free to like being able to have more staff to disciple, mentor, serve, free counseling, addiction recovery, housing aid, free clinics, food pantries, homeless shelters, counseling services, education programs in every community. All this could be run through the church if this amount was able to come through. Integrated generosity programs where needs are seen and met. Okay, that's a lot. But when we boil it down, giving isn't just about what it does for others. It does truly change you. It frees you from materialism. It realigns your values. It trains your heart to trust. It's not just discipline. It's about discipleship and following him, and the posture of your heart. What you give to, you grow toward. And that comes back to what Jesus said about where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So when it comes down to it, the question isn't whether generosity could change the world. I get that all of this is hypothetical. All of this is unrealistic of all of it happening at the exact same time. Everybody getting on board and being like, yes, let's do this. That's not the question. The question is whether you are actually going to start living it, because you can have that impact on your community. We talked about the 500 billion aspect on a global scale, but I think the more critical answer is proportionately, relative to your community, what impact could you have? What impact could your close friends have? What impact could your small group or family, if you started committing to start living in a generous way? There's so many creative ideas out there. We're going to be talking about it more. Leaning into this on a community level is ultimately the way to go, because I think the term world changer has a bit of a bad rap. I don't think it's about changing your world. And yeah, we can talk about things on the global level, but ultimately, when you get up in the morning, you have a world that you're operating in. And if how you see it starts changing, then the way that you handle your finances can start changing too. So I just wanted to take a moment to reflect and engage with Holy Spirit on these questions. First, where is my heart in generosity? Second, what is one faithful step I can take this month to move in a direction of generosity? Third, what could God do if I lived open-handed? I'm curious on this one. Last one, what would you dream up with $500 billion a year for good? So if you had that full amount, what would you do for good? Drop it in the comments below. I'll leave you with this. Start where you are, whether it's 1%, $50 a month, a neighbor in need, playing piano at a nursing home, random example from my childhood. The goal isn't the rule. It's a reorientation of it's not mine, it's his. And I think that's so hard. I'm not saying it's easy, but going together is the key. Generosity thrives in community. And the more we can open up these types of conversations, I think the more we'll see it start to happen, because money is a guarded thing. Money is close to the heart, but I think the more we can be vulnerable in circles and communities and in groups, the more we can start to see this happen. So thanks for joining me on this episode of The Finance Garden. This is Thomas Stewart signing off. Hey y'all, thanks so much for taking the time to watch this. If you find these types of conversations helpful, would you let me know? Or if there's anything that you'd like to hear or curious about, or any types of conversations you'd like to see, obviously still in the early stages and just building. So if you were like, this was super valuable and I feel like that people around me would find it valuable, do the thing that helps them find it valuable. I think the kids these days call it liking, subscribing, and commenting so that more people can see it. Appreciate you guys, excited to build with you and explore these topics with you guys. We'll catch you on the next one.